This presentation was originally delivered to the Stakeholder Focus Group number 1 for the Net Meter Revenue Policy Group. This was on July 10th, 2019. Let's start by going over where Portland's parking meter districts are. Meters were first installed in Portland in downtown in 1938. The downtown meter district expanded gradually over the years, including other sub-areas like the Pearl and South Waterfront neighborhoods. From 1997 to 2016, the city added 4 additional districts: Lloyd, Central East Side, Northwest, and Markham Hill. An important policy that led to the creation of these new districts is TRN 3.112. That might sound overly technical, but it's the fundamental policy that was adopted by Council in 1996. This policy states that, number 1, money has to be spent on transportation projects and activities. Number 2, the money first goes to covering the operating costs within a district. And number 3, then 51% of the remaining net meter revenue must be spent on transportation projects inside of the district. Note that this policy only applies to new meter districts and thus excludes the existing downtown district. Also note that the way that the 51% share of funds are allocated is through a separate budgetary process run by parking committees, including representatives of the businesses and stakeholders within each district, deciding which projects are the highest priority to fund each year. Evaluating this policy is at the heart of this project and what we will be asking the Stakeholder Focus Group for input on. Another important policy document that was more recently adopted is the Portland Parking Management Manual. The manual, adopted last year in 2018, clarifies guidelines and procedures related to parking meters in the city. These include the policy that the city only installs parking meters to manage parking problems, not for generating additional revenue. Additionally, formation of new parking meter districts begins with a request from the community and is not something instigated by the city itself. Also, the manual asserts that parking management involves more than just parking meters. It also includes establishing time limits, establishing event districts and truck loading zones, and enforcement of those time limits and other policies. One additional thing included in the parking management manual is describing performance-based pricing procedures, which is a new approach to establishing the rates for meters across the city in the future, helping to manage the parking supply even better than in the past. This project does not intend to revisit the policies articulated in the parking management manual. In addition to those policies that are focused specifically on parking meters, the city has a host of other important planning documents that establish goals, policies, and measures of success that are overarching and still applicable to this project. These documents include the 2035 Comprehensive Plan, the Transportation System Plan, and the PBOT Strategic Plan. These plans include goals that can be summarized as addressing 5 key themes: safety, taking urgent action to make our transportation system safer; moving people and goods, providing transportation options for our growing city; climate action, taking actions to reduce transportation's climate impact; asset management, making smart investments to maintain our transportation system; and racial equity, addressing equity and structural racism through our programs and investments. While goals are important for establishing policy direction, performance measures are useful for evaluating progress towards achieving those goals. The comprehensive plan has 13 different performance measures related to transportation. In the context of net meter revenue, we've summarized these performance measures to come up with the following short list: eliminating deaths and serious injuries in the transportation system, decreasing vehicles miles traveled, investing in projects that benefit historically marginalized people and areas, and reducing the city's maintenance backlog. Through this project, we want to ensure that the way net meter revenue is allocated aligns with these performance measures. Now that we have gone through some of the policy background, we're ready to move on to a financial overview related to parking meter revenue. The chart on the screen provides a big picture overview of PBOT's revenues. This shows the revenue allocation for fiscal year ending 2020, though it doesn't change much from year to year. A key thing to pay attention to is the distinction between discretionary and non-discretionary funds. When the city receives most money, it is non-discretionary, which means that there are certain restrictions on what it can be used for. For example, grants can only be used for the projects the city applied for, and systems development charges have to be spent on projects that are included on the capital projects list for SDCs. Fixing Our Streets gas tax revenue can only be spent on items that were pre-approved by voters. There's a smaller side of revenue, discretionary funds, that have far fewer restrictions on them. The largest of these is state and local gas tax revenue, but just behind that is parking meter revenue, generating roughly $36 million per year. The last slide showed over $340 million in annual revenue for PBOT. However, despite that level of funding, PBOT is forecasting a growing funding deficit in all future years. This funding deficit even assumes that the current level of service, which in and of itself is insufficient to address PBOT's full maintenance backlog, continues in the future. An extra $268 million would be needed each year for the next 10 years in order for the city to meet PBOT's target level of service for maintenance. The reason for this ongoing deficit is that most sources of funding, particularly gas tax, are not indexed for inflation or to account for increasing fuel efficiency. This results in little to no growth in revenue over time. Meanwhile, many costs, such as healthcare, retirement benefits, wages, and materials for construction, continue to increase over time, most of them outpacing general inflation. These two factors combine to show the deficit that's projected for the next several years for PBOT and into the ongoing future. So where does PBOT spend the money that it receives? PBOT's budget is split roughly equally between operations and maintenance and capital projects. Operations and maintenance costs are spread roughly evenly across the city, but capital costs vary geographically. This map shows the allocation of those total expenditures by neighborhood coalition. In general, the central city received the largest share of funding, with North and Northeast Portland receiving the least. Keeping in mind capital expenditures can be volatile from year to year, so this map can change significantly from one year to the next. However, the figures shown here are a 5-year average from 2015 through 2019. A closer look at the parking meter revenue generated and spent within each parking meter district is shown in this chart. Note that the chart excludes downtown because it wouldn't fit on the same slide. Downtown generates about $30 million of the $36 million in total meter revenue. For each of the other districts, a sizable portion of the revenue is spent on operations and maintenance, amortization of past capital purchases, including a set-aside to fund future capital equipment. The remaining funds are defined as net meter revenue and allocated 51% to each district, with the remaining 49% going to PBOT's General Transportation Revenue Fund. This means that in Northwest, the district that generates the most revenue other than downtown receives about $1 million per year in net meter revenue. The Lloyd district receives closer to $500,000 per year, and Central East Side and Markham Hill receive significantly less. One thing to note is that the city's operating costs for parking enforcement within these districts is not captured as part of the operations and maintenance that comes off the top before the net meter revenue is calculated. Instead, these enforcement costs are budgeted out of PBOT's General Transportation Revenue Fund. Thanks for bearing with me through the financial presentation. The next few slides talk about the scope of work for this project. For this project, we'll conduct public involvement, including the series of stakeholder focus group meetings, as well as outreach to the communities themselves. Additionally, market research will occur to ensure that we understand how potential policies might impact communities' decisions to adopt parking meters in the future. The work will include case studies looking at how other comparable cities across the country have chosen to allocate their parking meter revenue. We will make sure to include measures of success so we can easily document how well the different solutions will come to achieving the city's goals. All of the analysis will include an evaluation of financial impacts to ensure that the city's financial health is being considered through these policy outcomes. At the end of the day, we will come up with multiple policy alternatives that will be evaluated, including input from the stakeholder focus group, before coming up with a final recommendation to deliver to City Council. Work on this project began in the spring of 2019. In July, we had the first meeting of the stakeholder focus group. That group will be meeting 2 more times, once in August and once in September, to help craft the draft policy recommendations. Later this fall, we are intending to go to City Council with the final policy recommendation. For any questions about net meter revenue or this project, please contact Francesca Petricolo. Her contact information is here on the final slide. Thank you.